If you really think about it, all Darth Nihilus had to do was just kill Kreia before Knights of the Old Republic 2. If he did, his power would have gone unchecked, and he likely would have gone on to destroy and consume most of the Star Wars galaxy in one way or another. And we know this because Kreia was the character that guided the Jedi exile to regain her strength, but the question becomes, why didn't Nihilus kill her? Could it be that he couldn't kill her? Did he feel bad? Was it a form of arrogance or condescension? Well, I think the answer is definitely somewhere in the cracks of KOTOR 2's narrative. We just have to dig a little bit. But before we do dive into the story, let's talk about today's video sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by Fanhome. Fanhome are dedicated to making incredible collector's items and build-up models, and right now they have an awesome R2-D2. Each month you'll receive an officially licensed piece of R2-D2 made out of ABS and metal. You'll also receive comprehensive and illustrated magazines, and R2 himself includes projectors and so much more to make him really come to life. So, if you want to make a fine addition to your Star Wars collections, check out the link below. It'll take you to Fanhome's website where you can learn more. Now, of course, one could assume that if Darth Nihilus' power grew exponentially, the Jedi exile would have kind of been forced in one way or another to ultimately confront him, regardless of Kreia's intervention. Because there's going to come a point where Nihilus needs to consume the Jedi exile if he's consuming all life, right? However, I would argue this wouldn't happen simply off the basis that 1. The Jedi exile would never reconnect to the Force anyway without Kreia's intervention, and even if Atris had managed to find her as she planned, she would have just used the exile as bait and tried to confront the Sith herself, and she would have objectively lost. That is an interesting idea though, maybe for another video. And from there on, you could argue the only things that could really start to contend with Nihilus would be Vitiate, the Ones, and some of the more obscure things in the Star Wars galaxy. But that is an entirely different topic. But circling back to the original premise of the video, why didn't Darth Nihilus kill Kreia? Because he had the opportunity to do so. She was right there, and instead he presumably fails his Force drain. He lets Sion do unspeakable things to her, and they presume she is dead. And the reason I say presumably a lot here is because we don't know the objective truth. But what we can believe to be true is that Sion did think Kreia was dead because, of course, in their first meeting he says,
"After all that's happened, still you live. You are difficult to kill."
To me, this comes across more as a surprise that she's alive than a "I knew you are alive and I've come to kill you" kind of attitude. So when Kreia says that she was stripped of her power and exiled, I think this speaks to more of a personal exiling in which she had given up with the Sith ideology over being directly exiled by the Sith with intent. And so because of that, I think their intent was to kill Kreia, and they failed. They presumed that she was dead at their hands, and somehow she escaped. To add more fuel to this, there is also the cut content between Sion and Nihilus, where Sion reveals to Nihilus that he failed to kill Darth Treya as he had assumed.
There is more. Darth Treya yet lives. You did not kill her as you assumed. She did what with all your power you could not do. Our alliance is finished. I have no need of you.
So with all of this information, we can kind of come to the conclusion that both Sith Lords intended for Kreia to die, which further reinforces the idea that the Sith didn't let her go with any kind of intent. And so I want to talk about some of the theories as to why Nihilus did let her go. One common theory is that Kreia was let go because of his arrogance. They let her live without the Force to show her how useless she is. They exiled her from the Sith in an insulting kind of way that mirrored her experience with the Jedi. But based on Sion's surprise that she was alive and Nihilus's rage from the cut content, neither Sith really wanted her to live, so I think this theory can be ruled out, and I think we can also mostly rule out the idea that Nihilus allowed her to survive because of his remaining humanity. There's a lot of evidence that points to Nihilus letting Visas Mar live sometime after, because he himself, like Visas, had suffered a great tragedy in which all of those he loved had died, and so it's believed that his last act of humanity was to keep this woman alive who had also suffered the same fate. You have to remember, Nihilus wasn't this big evil Sith monster who wanted domination initially. He was just a normal, seemingly good person who could form bonds like the Jedi Exile, who, unlike her, was consumed by his wound in the Force and was ultimately transformed into this all-consuming black hole. In fact, I've got a whole video about this. I will link it in the top right if you want to learn more. But even with that said, based on Nihilus's reaction, I think it's unlikely that he let her go the same way he did Visas. However, one could argue his reaction was regret, the realization that in hindsight, those last vestiges of his humanity had come back to haunt him. So while I wouldn't entirely rule out that idea, I do think it's unlikely. However, with all of this said, I actually think the truth lies more closely with Darth Sion than Darth Nihilus. The creator of Knights of the Old Republic 2, Chris Avellone, was on record saying that he didn't think Darth Nihilus was the kind of Sith to get his hands dirty, which, you know, makes a lot of sense. And so, because of this, when they arrive to confront her, Nihilus uses some kind of ability to disconnect Kreia from the Force, and then he simply watches as Sion does the rest. And while it may have been Nihilus's idea to strip Kreia of her power and kill her at the heart of Malachor, he maybe wasn't aware of how much of a grip Kreia had on Sion. And we know this throughout the many interactions in the game in which Sion is always going on about how she crawls in his skull with whispers. And most interestingly, in their first meeting, when Sion does say that she is difficult to kill, Kreia simply says,
"For one as limited as you, perhaps, to have fallen so far and learned nothing, that is your failing."
Alluding to the fact that maybe even Kreia knew that Nihilus wasn't the one to try and land the killing blow. I also think that this would weave in and create a consistent narrative regarding their confrontation, where Sion says that Nihilus failed to kill Kreia, and instead Nihilus's response is more of an irritation that he didn't do it himself, and that this is Sion goading Nihilus. In a way, it's him saying that this was your idea, so it was your failure, not mine. And Nihilus's reaction after that, where he just kind of throws Sion around the Ravager and tries to kill him, is even more of an indication of his frustration and rage towards his fellow Sith. But then, of course, if this is the truth, the question then shifts. If Sion was responsible for killing Kreia, why didn't he? And things become even more complicated because Kreia and Sion's relationship is very unique. One could apply the theory that I mentioned earlier and say that Sion actually left her alive as an insult. We know all too well his obsession with the Force, and against the Triumvirate's decision, maybe he decided to leave her alive to make her live with her failure and without the thing he believed most powerful, the dark side. Perhaps she used some kind of cloaking power, tricking them into thinking she was dead, the same way she tricks us and many people during the game. However, this is unlikely because at this point she was supposedly disconnected from the Force, so using this ability in a way that would completely cloud two powerful Sith Lords' minds like this would be questionable to say the least. Instead of cloaking, I actually think it was more likely that Kreia planned it, expecting her students to betray her and manipulating the weaker one into thinking that he was strong and powerful and so completely above her that her death would be a waste of time. And then, when necessary, she would simply teach him the lesson that he failed to grasp so many other times, as she mentions to him often in the game. Perhaps she wanted to become disconnected to the Force in this moment so she could become invisible to those that were hunting her and put her plans into motion with the Jedi exile. But with all of that said, I think the truth is we just don't know. Sion's role is complicated, but I think to answer the question of the video as to why Darth Nihilus didn't kill Kreia, it was simply because he didn't want to get his hands dirty in regard to the dust motes in the storm that he was. It was a powerful Sith Lord who, as we know, likes to sit in the shadows and let others do his dirty work until he could come in and impact things on a grand scale, that expected Darth Sion to finish the job and incorrectly believed that he had done so. And the irony of this is that dust mote he believed to be so inconsequential would be the catalyst that led to his downfall. Now, as so much else of Knights of the Old Republic 2, the answer isn't entirely clear, and the ideas that I brought up in this video aren't the objective truth, and of course that is the beauty of the game and why we keep talking about it today. And I'm curious to know, why do you think that the two Sith Lords failed or chose not to kill Kreia? I would love to know your thoughts, so let me know down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, it helps me out so much. And if you haven't, perhaps consider subscribing to join the biggest growing Knights of the Old Republic community on YouTube. And if you want some more awesome KOTOR content like this, you should check this video out. It's an in-depth look into how Kreia learned to destroy the Force. I'll see you there.